Good afternoon, and thank you. I am Joanna Hersey, and I am thrilled to be here representing the Historic Brass Society, where I serve as secretary and as a member of the board. While inclusion and belonging are buzzwords lately, for me, these ideas have been my life's work. After leaving my education to join the United States Coast Guard Band, I found the nearby university could not accommodate active duty military unavailable during the day. However, a new major was taking hold in 1990s America, one which began on the fringes of academia and in classes held at night after the main work of the traditional degrees was done. That new area was gender studies. I found a welcoming home in a department used to adaptability and overcoming challenge, and so it came to be that I earned my Bachelor of Arts in Gender and Sexuality Studies, having done every project throughout the degree on music. It took me 6 years of part-time study, but was an experience that changed my life as I wore a uniform during the day and joined classroom discussions late into the night. As a woman making a living out of tuba playing, they were speaking my language. I continued to center gender and belonging through my master and doctoral degrees, and my dissertation outlined activities of women in American brass performance, a topic that was risky at the time, as my dissertation advisor exclaimed, "But how will you find any sources?" It was at that same time that I received an invitation to perform at a new and unknown event, something called the International Women's Brass Conference, formed to help folks network in those pre-internet days. I attended and gave performances as part of the first all-female military tuba euphonium quartet and met inspiring women who became lifelong friends. I joined the Women's Brass Conference, of course, later became president for a 6-year term, and now, as past president, can speak authentically about our challenges. Today, I have 2 goals in my brief time with you: to showcase just a few of the many activities of 19th century American women in brass, and to compare the 19th century situation with our current world in hopes of drawing parallels and contrasts which can aid our understanding. The first step in our discussion is the reminder that on the continent which would be named North America, music was being made by women throughout the history of Native peoples. This music making never stopped through conquest, hardship, and triumph, and continues today. Any presentation on 19th century American music must be set in an understanding of activities and musical lives lived in addition to, not instead of, Native music making. Today, we are curious about one small area of this 19th century landscape, the brass ladies. But they must be viewed as one part of a larger whole, one which recognizes all as equally valid. So, as we vow to keep the native story and experience in our minds throughout, we tell a story of a new people who arrived on American shores through settlement and via the slave trade from the 17th century forward. Let's cast our minds back to New Year's Eve, 1899. Those celebrating were familiar with a world in which women brass players worked in bands, orchestras, as soloists, and in chamber ensembles across the nation. They were seen on large stages and small, from Boston to Minnesota and on to the western coast. Between 1800 and 1900, the population of the United States grew from 5 to 76 million across 45 states, and New York remained the largest city. Our partygoers celebrating New Year's Eve, 1899, would have experienced many changes over that period, characterized by westward expansion, industrialization, the Civil War, and the beginnings of the Great Migration, immigration, and more. During that time, most Americans stopped farming. In 1800, 83% of American labor worked in agriculture. By 1899, it was down to 33%. This meant many had coins earned through paid labor of other sorts and lived in larger, more populated centers with a small bit of leisure time to fill. The partiers of New York in 1899 could go to 33 different theaters along Broadway, using the elevated train lines constructed by 1870. In the 30 years prior to that New Year's Eve, nearly 12 million immigrants arrived through Ellis Island and elsewhere, intent on bettering their lives, bringing musical traditions and instruments with them. Women players really got their start in our American landscape performing in family bands, a way for them to flex their brass muscles inside a safe and accepted musical format, under the direction and authority of a parental, usually father, figure. From the 1860s forward, we see the love of brass flourish. Bands became even more popular after the Civil War, which created sets of instruments across the nation with sets of people who could play and teach them. These were not immune to feminine takeover. We see bands like the Ross and Shepherd families and many more working successfully across the latter half of the 19th century and continuing into the vaudeville era. An extension of this are orphanage bands, which kept this same spirit under questionable conditions and processes, but everyone agrees of the benefit of brass playing as an activity to properly bring up young people. Public school education, only a dream at the beginning of the American colonies, became a reality by 1900 and contributed much to the development of bands and orchestras and the players to play in them. Across the 19th century, public schools created the need for teacher training, and a growth of colleges and universities resulted. By New Year's Eve, 1899, there were approximately 721 institutions of higher education in the United States, many of whom welcomed young women into their ranks. Central to this was new federal funding granted to states for the purpose of founding colleges that spurred the founding of many of the nation's historically black colleges, where music programs flourished, such as my neighbor's, Fayetteville State University, founded in 1867 in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and what was to become UNC Pembroke, where I teach, founded in 1887 by the local Native American population to train teachers. Female musicians and musicians of color in the 19th century worked in a context of increasing freedoms. A meeting in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 popularized the fight for women's rights, including the vote, and high-profile women of color, such as Ida Wells and Sojourner Truth, were working in the abolitionist movement. Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation freed the enslaved and led to the Civil War. 19th century women could not own property, but in 1862, the Homestead Act allowed some women this right for the first time, unfortunately tied to the settlement and violence in westward expansion. In 1870, the 15th Amendment granted the right to vote to black men, a huge step forward for the nation, which sadly did not extend to women. Outside of the farm, women in the workplace tended to be separated by gender, a condition continued by musicians. Women in the garment industry had begun to unionize in 1825, and black female laundry workers executed one of the largest and most effective strikes in the history of the South in 1881. This was important for female brass musicians because the publicity about working women made this concept normal across the industries. These efforts to be treated fairly in the workplace were in contrast to the decline of farming as the most common economic household setup. In farming, it was completely clear that everyone's efforts and safety were needed for survival. While some tasks may be traditionally divided by gender, all hands are needed on the farm. The decline of farming and the distance away from those ideals brought a change in the status of women across the 19th century. Women who remained home while husbands worked outside the home began to be seen as a status symbol. This, of course, discounted the work of families who needed both incomes to survive. Female musicians first began learning their craft in family groups and later were welcomed into the new music conservatories, which had sprung up around the nation. In 1868, Boston's New England Conservatory of Music, my alma mater and the home of the library you see here, had 1,097 female and 317 male students enrolled, though it reserved its violin scholarships only for men. It was the love and popularity of the violin which helped all brass players, but especially young collegiate women. All those well-trained music conservatory female graduates who had studied with strong teachers and performed at the top of their game in their student ensembles wanted to keep playing after graduation. Beginning in the 1880s and continuing into the new century, these women, unwelcome at auditions for the established all-male professional orchestras, created their own. It wasn't long before all-female orchestras had been founded in major cultural centers across the country. Working successfully as soloists and orchestral players, these violinists and their careers helped pave the way for early brass soloists, mostly on cornet. It was the soloists who arguably captured the spirit of the 19th-century woman most strongly. They arrived, often child stars, from early family band experience, inspired by the success of the violin stars. Anna Teresa Berger began playing cornet with her family's musical touring company full-time at the ripe old age of 10 in 1863. Helen May Butler charmed audiences first on the violin before taking the podium. Elsie Allen toured the vaudeville circuit with Jessica Lynn, and Ethel Pearl Mitchell serenading audiences, and later Cora Youngblood. After family bands and soloists came a boom of orchestral and band ensemble formation. The Boston Fedette Ladies Orchestra, founded in 1888, is a fine example. The group gave more than 6,000 concerts and logged over 550,000 miles, performing from coast to coast in the U.S. and Canada, and giving performances in all but 3 states. Over 600 women performed a repertoire of more than 5,000 standard classical works, earning a combined total of more than $500,000. I studied the concert programs in the special collections of the Boston Public Library and found that over the 32-year existence of the orchestra, at least 5 different women played tuba with the group. The orchestra performed until around 1920 and was followed by the Boston Ladies Symphony Orchestra, and in 1927 the Boston Women's Symphony Orchestra was founded, and 75% of their brass section were Fedette veterans. These orchestras were staffed with women who didn't just play for fun and then leave the field. They were still there when new work came along years later. Alongside orchestras, family bands, town bands, and brass bands flourished, especially welcoming to women in the West, where choices were limited. Helen May Butler founded her Ladies Military Brass Band after having success with an all-female orchestra beginning in 1891. In 1910, cornet soloist and conductor Laura Antoinette Reiter formed the American Ladies Grand Concert Band. Cora Youngblood formed the Ladies Cornet Band of Anadarko in her small Oklahoma town in 1903 and ended up playing for the president and taking the world by storm. College bands and orchestras were also incredibly popular. Young Native American students in my university filled the air with brass band music for the commencement exercises of 1909, and both brass and wind bands could be found across the nation. These were made up of families of war veterans and school children from Baltimore to San Francisco. America fell in love with the theater and the variety show, something new and different every few minutes. Bands and chamber music groups showcased a variety of programming, from soloists and various ensemble combinations with singing and recitation. These activities set up the career opportunities for women after the turn of the century. Later, in 1914, Edna White toured with a quartet in addition to her work as soloist. In common with the Cleveland Ladies Orchestra and the Chicago Ladies Orchestra, trumpeter Fern Cashford toured her quartet across the nation, giving everyone a renewed appreciation for the euphonium in chamber music settings. The vaudeville movement was good for 19th century women brass musicians, as it enabled them to make money and gain professional experience, while generally more fair because it valued the act and the ability to entertain as the main criteria for booking. Even there, musicians of color fought for equality and worked on a separate circuit with unending restrictions and hardships. Pianist Doyle Dungill began as a vaudevillian, and he and his wife were joined later by their 7 children in the Dungill Family Concert Company, which began touring in the 1920s through into the 1950s when daughter Gloria played the tuba in this fine example of the power of the family band. The positive career forward motion did not last. During the 20th century, female musicians were done with activities in a separate sphere and asked for a place in the normal sphere. college women trained alongside their male counterparts but found little support for their subsequent careers. Back in 1871, a woman's magazine shared the reader opinion that violin star Camilla Urso was surely woman enough to vote, but it would take another 49 years. In 1900, the Married Women's Property Act became the law in all states, allowing women most financial rights, including collecting debts and filing a lawsuit. Women's rights activists demanded and received more and got closer to the male professions, creating a more substantial threat to the status quo. The 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, guaranteed everyone the right to vote across all 50 states. Women played during World War II, but after the war, it felt more restricted than ever. The nation reckoned with race in the years leading up to the Civil Rights Movement, and the feminist waves which tried to get the momentum back could only do so much. By the 1970s, women could finally get a credit card without their husband's signature, and birth control became more widely available. With 19th century women playing in a separate realm, society was used to women at work, especially in groups with other women. Those who were most successful came out of a family situation where child stars were connected in some way to collegiate life or worked in all-female groups, all situations which are entertaining without feeling threatening. It wasn't always fair, but many examples exist of successful careers. Music was booming, and there seemed plenty to go around. Today, classical music isn't booming anymore. Female players in the 21st century ask for the main groups this time. Instead of keeping women out completely, as was the case in the late 19th century, today's top orchestral and military brass sections are open to anyone, in theory, but in America remain 95% male. When asked to consider why, the tired answers are women don't want these jobs, or women's bodies prevent them from attaining that level. Those women who do reach that level are somehow considered the exception to the rule, but they are the great-granddaughters of Helen May Butler, Anna Berger, and Fern Cashford. Today's young professionals can feel alone, and efforts to organize and find camaraderie are not always available, can be seen as competitive or unnecessary. They can less often take advantage of competence factors which enabled 19th century women, such as family bands and being child stars. Today's millennials and Gen Zs have been raised with the idea that they can do and be anything, and many are not interested in talking about or fighting sexism in brass playing. They feel discouraged and often leave for less frustrating fields. In my final thoughts this morning, I offer 3 action items. Firstly, let's agree to call out changing the truth of the past. For example, the American Federation of Musicians celebrated their 125th year with a newsletter that nowhere mentioned that women and all people of color were not admitted. In fact, the pamphlet from 2021 says that by 1906, virtually all instrumental musicians in the U.S. were union members. But that is wrong. Women and people of color had to form a separate set of unions, and tubist Cora Youngblood was drummed out of her career altogether when she tried to fight them. This Philadelphia marker reminds us. Next, let's encourage tough conversations. It's okay to talk about uncomfortable topics, to question, to change tradition, and to call out bad behavior. Lastly, support groups working to promote all types of scholarship and hold events where all are welcome, like this one, where open, honest conversation is encouraged. Set up spaces to talk about social justice in the spirit of celebrating the best parts of our past. With the wisdom to grow from mistakes and bad decisions, we forge ahead together, united by our love for these frustrating but endearing instruments, telling amazing stories of music and joy. Today, we told the story of a bright and energetic 19th century brass community, men and especially women who fell in love with these instruments and the magic of their sound. But after that New Year's Eve party, the new century dawned, societal pressures mounted, and there came a backwards slide. The 20th century challenged the gains made during the 19th, and we didn't realize our potential. Where we go from here is up to us. Thank you.